Welcome to How to Fix It. I'm John Avlon. The purpose of this podcast is to focus on finding solutions to the problems we face, not just fixating on the problems themselves. But this week's guest, Ambassador Nicholas Burns, I wanted to bring on because I could not get over the images of President Xi of China with Vladimir Putin of Russia and India's Prime Minister Modi. You know, life, news, politics is often a struggle between the urgent and the important. But that might be the most important image out of our time, potentially changing the geostrategic trajectory of our century and helping us break it all down, as well as what Trump administration is doing, seemingly empowering China almost every step of the way, is Ambassador Nicholas Burns. He is a legendary leader of the State Department in many capacities, most recently Ambassador to China under the Biden administration. He is currently professor and director at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Ambassador Burns, it's good to see you, sir.
Thank you, John. Nice to be with you. It's a lot to talk about.
We got a lot to talk about. So first of all, give folks a sense of perspective of what it means that Trump's diplomatic mismanagement of the Modi relationship, his imposition of tariffs much higher than Iran-Pakistan, while China has still gotten its tariffs delayed, seems to have pushed India into the camp of Russia and China, as opposed to the longstanding effort that's been in place to try to make sure that America was aligned with India to be a counterweight to China. Put it in context for us.
Well, that's exactly it. And every American president, Democrat and Republican, going back to Bill Clinton, has made a concerted effort, a real national priority to grow closer to India so that we can have some leverage on China. India can help the United States, Japan, there are other allies in East Asia to limit China's expansion of power in the Indo-Pacific. And I was involved in this in the George W. Bush administration, where India was a major priority. Every president has done this. And suddenly, President Trump has put the issue of tariffs beyond our national security. He currently has 50% tariffs placed on Indian products coming into the United States, which is very injurious to the Indian economy. And that has driven Prime Minister Modi to do something he had not done in 7 years, and that's visit China. You saw the images from Beijing over the last couple of days for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting there. And this means that the United States at this point cannot count on India to be part of our effort in a lot of different ways to limit what the Chinese are trying to do. Under President Biden, he was meeting at the head of government level with the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, with the Japanese, with the Australians, and the so-called Quad. The Chinese, I can tell you, I was on the ground in Beijing for 3 years. They feared the Quad because they knew that these were four very powerful countries in the Pacific who wanted to live in peace with China, but didn't want to be pushed around by China, and were willing to use our collective leverage to stop the Chinese or prevent the Chinese from doing things that weren't in our interest. We've now given that away. So I think this has been a strategic era of the first order of importance for the United States, and I really hope that the Trump administration is going to reconsider this and stop thinking that tariffs is the be-all and end-all. There are issues that are a lot more important. Let me give you an example, John. Over the last 2 decades, India has been a major military partner of the United States, not an ally, but a partner. In the Bay of Bengal to the east of the subcontinent, in the Western Pacific, we do air exercises, naval exercises. Our militaries are working together. And this is of profound importance to us. We don't want that to be at risk because suddenly we're challenging India economically in a way that's going to be very injurious to them.
Well, I mean, this is an owned goal, right? I mean,
that's exactly what it is.
To put it in perspective, I mean, for a long time, going back to Nixon and Kissinger meeting with Mao, the idea was that we create a wedge between two communist nations, that historically China and Russia had a lot of tensions. Certainly that's been the case between India and China. And so to push Modi in this direction is flies in the face of history and longstanding cultural tension between these two countries. I mean, how bad do you have to be to force India into China's arms?
Well, and you're exactly right. There is a border conflict between China and India of long standing. These two countries fought a war way back in Mao's time in 1962. And in 2019, Chinese troops crossed the border. This is high up in the Himalayas. And they infringed on Indian sovereignty. And since then, the Indians have relied on the relationship with the United States, with Japan, with Australia to support them politically in this border dispute, but more importantly, to put India's weight behind our efforts. And so I didn't anticipate at all that the prime minister would attend this summit a year ago, or even 7 or 8 months ago when I was still in China. In fact, I was working very closely with the Indian government on efforts to try to limit China. All that now is at risk. And the Indians are also vying with the Chinese in a way for leadership in Asia. India has surpassed China in population. India's economy is not nearly as big or as strong as China's, but if you look out 1 or 2 or 3 decades from now, I think it's almost like the tortoise and the hare. China's been racing ahead for a generation now, but India is steadily making progress. Its economy is growing at a much faster rate than the Chinese economy. So if we want to be strategic about this, we've got to think of the world we want to live in, and your little kids and my grandchildren will want to live in 15, 20, 30 years from now. We should want to have India on our side because China is going to be a competitor with the United States for our kids and our grandchildren. So I actually think if you look at all of American foreign policy, this mistake of driving India away from us, it's about the most serious mistake that I think President Trump has made since he took office.
And that is saying something.
That says a lot. And I meant in foreign policy. I'm not commenting on the domestic agenda, but it says a lot. This is of a supreme order of magnitude. And I really hope that members of the Senate and the House in both parties who have supported this initiative to grow closer to India, it would be good to see them speak up, put their weight behind a reconsideration of what's been happening.
This show is sponsored by OneSkin. I worked in cable news for a long time. I used to joke that I was a grown man who had to wear makeup to work. So I know that cameras can be pretty unforgiving and that the importance of having clean skin. So OneSkin is actually designed to keep your face looking its best. It's got a proprietary OS01 peptide, which is the first ingredient ever proven to switch off damaged sentient cells that cause lines, wrinkles, and thin, crepey skin. Free from over 1,500 chemicals and preservatives that can make skin red, irritated, or itchy, their products are certified safe for sensitive skin, dermatologist tested, and approved by independent testing platforms like SkinSafe. They've got over 6,300 five-star reviews for their full line of face, body, sun, and travel styles products. OneSkin's multi-purpose products proves you don't need a complicated routine to achieve healthier skin. The cleanser and topical supplements can all be used with other products or treatments to easily fit into your current skincare routine, if it exists. OneSkin is the world's first skin longevity company. By focusing on the cellular aspects of aging, OneSkin keeps your skin looking and acting younger for longer. For a limited time, you can try OneSkin with a 15% off using code FIXIT at oneskin.co. oneskin.co. That's 15% off oneskin.co with code FIXIT, all caps. Now, if you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please show your support to the show and tell them we sent you. Give your skin the scientifically proven gentle care it deserves with OneSkin. Well, bipartisanship has failed us in recent years. I should mention, just to people to understand, and you referred to it, that you have bipartisan credibility. You have served in the administrations at senior levels of Democrats and Republicans. So this is about the national security interest of the United States, not reflecting a partisan perspective at all.
That's exactly right.
That gets me to one of the biggest mysteries to me about this second Trump administration. In the first term, the Trump administration upended what had been bipartisan approach to China that believed that entering into the WTO would create a nation state that would be a strategic competitor but would play by the rules. Now we clearly know that isn't the case. And there hasn't been a bipartisan shift. A lot of the tough on China policies that were started under Trump were extended and expanded under the Biden administration. Not looking for conflict, but looking to take the strategic threat seriously. And yet, in this second term, there has been a series of actions by President Trump that seem to empower China. Things like the TikTok bill, which was a Republican bill, upheld 9-0 by the Supreme Court, keeps getting pushed out and punted. I would argue unconstitutionally, by President Trump. The other day, he reverses himself on the H-20 chips, which would seem to give a huge technological boost to China's AI ambitions, while taking 15% of the profits from American companies that are selling those chips. He says that we should have 600,000 Chinese students in the United States, then downgrades it to 300,000. Just the other day, we found out that among the Republican congressional bill's cuts was an effort to create a 5G network as a counterweight to Huawei. What is going on? Help me understand what the hell the Trump administration thinks it's doing by actually empowering and emboldening China.
Well, your list is long and your list is accurate. And, I think that President Trump has obviously been focusing in the first 7 or 8 months of this term as president on the Russia-Ukraine war, on the Middle East, on the border issues, on immigration. We really haven't seen a full articulation of what the strategy is towards China. But there are indications, and you've listed 7 or 8 of them, that I agree are worrisome. It's interesting because I think if you look at the individual cabinet secretaries, many of them have a history of being China hawks. And you're not seeing that from President Trump, who I think is more pragmatic. He's been very solicitous. Or transactional is another way to put it. He's been very solicitous of President Xi Jinping in public. I don't think he's ever said anything negative about him, which is not a bad thing in state-to-state relations, because President Biden didn't say a lot of critical things either of President Xi himself, although he did of the government of China. And so I'm not sure we've seen the full articulation of what the strategy is. That's point one. But point two, obviously, there's going to come a time fairly soon when the Trump administration is going to have to unveil what it's trying to do. And you mentioned an issue that's very important, and that's keeping advanced American dual-use technology out of China. Now, the reason we did that in the Biden administration is because we didn't want to give the People's Liberation Army the most important dual-use technology we have, say, advanced semiconductors for AI purposes, because they would use that technology to try to gain an advantage over our military in this big contest for military power that's underway between China and the United States. So it made great sense for the Biden administration almost 3 years ago to put these restrictions and export controls in place. We had bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats in Congress. And frankly, I just assumed when President Trump came back into power that he would leave these in place, and he hasn't. So that's test number one. You mentioned TikTok. There's a bill in Congress that says that that TikTok has to be sold. It's going to operate in the United States. It is a law, and yet that law has not been honored. Third example, which we talked about before, but it bears repeating. I think the fundamental lesson I learned as ambassador to China, and maybe throughout my entire career, is, fortunately, we have a very strong country, and we support American strength around the world. But when we partner with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, with the Philippines, with India, to try to limit the Chinese, we're much more powerful, even more powerful. And I think that's what worries me the most, that President Trump is going in alone in foreign policy. He has put high tariffs on nearly all those allied countries. The U.S.-Japan relationship, the U.S.-South Korea relationship are as weak now as I've seen them. And I wanted to mention this because when I was sitting in Beijing, I had the distinct impression that what bothered the Chinese government the most was that President Biden had strengthened all these relationships, and that China on Xinjiang, on Tibet, on Hong Kong, on what they were doing on cyber aggression, a whole host of issues, they were hearing from not just us, but a chorus of democratic allies, and we were trying to block them and limit them in various parts of the world. That's all gone away, and that is a real problem, I think, for the United States. We are, I think, more powerful than China, but it's close on the power metrics. But if you add Japan and the EU alone to our side, that's 60% of global GDP. That's where leverage comes from in any kind of geostrategic calculation. And it's what we've got to maintain, but we may be giving it away. And we may be seeing ourselves give it away, our government, over the last few months.
We are giving it away. Let's be clear. The short-term thinking, the focus on tariffs is ruining long-term alliances. It's fracturing our alliances with our democratic allies, which we don't need to get into, but we all understand. But you're right to point out, Japan and South Korea, that we are alienating our longtime allies because of a fixation on tariffs, which may end up being overturned by the Supreme Court itself. But on that front, this is one of the really curious things. Trump has imposed 50% tariffs on India. I think 19% on Pakistan, which is part of the reason there's so much irritation by Prime Minister Modi. But he keeps pushing out, talking tough, but pushing out tariffs on China. What is the Chinese strategic assessment of that action? Because I could imagine it looks a lot like weakness, not strength.
Well, we've gone over some of the issues that may lead the Chinese to believe that we're weakening in our position. I think on tariffs, it's slightly different. I think it's legitimate for the United States to use tariffs against China because China hasn't played by the rules on intellectual property theft, on forced technology transfer. These are problems that American businesses have in China, and China is our third largest trade partner. We have thousands of American companies in China, so it really matters. President Trump put in place a series of tariffs in his first term in 2019 and 20. President Biden kept all of President Trump's tariffs, so there was agreement between them on this. And then President Biden raised the ante. In May of 2024, President Biden put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, 50% on semiconductors, and 25% on lithium batteries. And President Trump has kept those in place. So I think in this instance, we've seen unity between President Trump and President Biden on tariffs. But the end game is going to be interesting because I think both the United States and China are heading towards a trade deal. So the question will be, what do we give up? What do we not give up? But I don't dislike at all the fact that President Trump has been tough-minded on China on tariffs, but it's how we get to the end game. What final deal will we make or not make? That'll answer the question, what are we trying to achieve in our economic relationship with China?
And to be clear, I have no problem with being tough and tariffs on China. To your point, it's the constant delay and it's what we give up. I think sometimes economic interests trump everything else, no pun intended, in the mind of this president. One of the things that you've had to deal with as ambassador to China, President Biden spoke bluntly about it, is Taiwan. And this is something that the CHIPS Act was a far-sighted policy to reshore essential manufacturing, particularly on semiconductors. But the Trump administration, again, for all the talking tough about China, seems to have sent yellow lights around Taiwan, where previously there was a strong red light from the President of the United States. Are you concerned that China might feel that this administration might be a good time to blockade Taiwan, rather?
I hope not. And again, I don't want to be unfair to the Trump administration by casting judgment, because I'm not sure we've seen enough and heard enough from the administration on what's their theory of the case. How do we make it difficult for the Chinese to think about a blockade, to think about, God forbid, a cross-strait invasion in the Taiwan Strait against Taiwan itself? And, we've been remarkably consistent ever since President Nixon went to China in 1972. Every American president has had a one China policy, but we've also, and that's been clear, but we've also made it clear that we don't think it's at all legitimate for China to think about the use of force against Taiwan. And every administration has tried to help Taiwan think about how to defend itself. President Biden did that. In the early months of this term of President Trump, there was an arms sale, and I supported it, by the Trump Department of Defense to Taiwan. But in recent months, we've seen indications that maybe they're pulling back. So I really hope that they're going to toughen up here, because knowing the Chinese, as I do, the People's Republic government in Beijing, they need to see a tough, consistent American approach on an issue of Taiwan. And our position has to be, in this case, in terms of the defense of Taiwan, that we're going to give Taiwan, help them acquire the kind of asymmetric weaponry that would drive down the probability that China would seek a cross-strait invasion or a blockade. So there's a lot at stake here. This is the most difficult relationship and potentially the most combustible in the entire U.S.-China relationship. And so I hope we're going to see a tough-minded approach by the Trump administration.
Well, I certainly, the Chinese, as you just said, respect strength and consistency. And the consistency seems to be wavering. I do want to speak about the Salt Typhoon hack, which had been previously announced, but New York Times this week publishing an article saying it may have compromised the information of every single American. Understanding that there's some things you can't say. Put that in context for folks. I mean, people maybe get used to their privacy being violated and they think it's academic. Why would the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, feel a need to have information on every single American?
Well, there's a lot that I cannot say and will not say in this subject, obviously, given the sensitivity of it. But what I can do is go back to what the then FBI Director Chris Wray said publicly in congressional testimony and speeches back in 23 and 24, and what the United States and I think 8 other countries said a couple of weeks ago publicly about this, and that is that China uses cyber in a very aggressive way, not just to go at American companies to limit their ability to be successful in a place like China, but also to intrude on the grid in the United States and the infrastructure of the United States. And there was this remarkable New York Times story, Wall Street Journal had this story as well, that every American, this is what the journalist said, might be affected by this. We've long known and have said publicly that China is the major cyber aggressor in the world. And obviously, we've got to mount a defense to that. I don't think this is a bipartisan difference here. I think Republicans and Democrats do agree that we've got to do everything we can to protect our country and to warn the Chinese about the consequences here. Every president since President George W. Bush's time has been clear with the Chinese about the ramifications of this and the cost to doing this. And so I do think there are lots of U.S.-China policy that are bipartisan in nature. When I was ambassador, I often felt that one of the strengths I had was the fact that Republicans and Democrats standing behind me, members of Congress, for instance, were unified and sending a unified message to China. And this is certainly an issue where Americans need to be united and tell the Chinese with one clear and loud voice that there are going to be consequences for them if they continue to play this game. But I think I would urge people to look at these press articles because they're very worrisome. And these articles are really based on what has been said publicly by the Trump administration and the Biden administration.
So I want to press you on that point because I agree about the bipartisanship, which is why the inconsistency recently is so jarring, frankly. But when you say consequences, what are the appropriate consequences from a diplomatic standpoint that can actually be a deterrent? Because it's clear that deterrents haven't worked. They continue to be as aggressive on cyber as anything else. So from a government standpoint, what's an appropriate response? What's an appropriate consequence?
Well, first, I think the Trump administration was correct a couple of weeks ago in announcing publicly with other like-minded democratic countries that all of us have been victims. And so one way, I think, always to go at the Chinese is not just individually as one country, but to try to get a group of countries to sing off the same sheet of music and to give a consistent, loud, and tough message to the Chinese. I found that on Xinjiang, on the rights of the Uyghurs. I found it on Tibet and other human rights issues, certainly on the issue of keeping advanced technology from the West, from Japan, from South Korea, from Germany, the United States, out of China. And I think on this issue too, John, we need to get lots of countries behind us. And I think the Trump administration has begun to do that, which is a good thing. So, I've not been a partisan of President Trump, but when he does something good and effective, I think it's my responsibility to acknowledge it. And I think on this issue, he is heading in the right direction. Now, it also depends on the ability to talk to them at the most senior level. And that does mean President Xi Jinping and the other members of the Standing Committee and the Politburo. The message has to be delivered at that senior level.
Look, I 100% believe that in the spirit of fairness, you give credit where credit is due. It does seem that the threat of consequences does not seem to be having the deterrent effect. Maybe diplomatically, but the incursions keep coming from a cyber standpoint.
Every president since President George W. Bush, certainly President Obama, who made this a priority when he was president, has delivered the message publicly on the record to the Chinese government and population. And you're right. The Chinese, these press reports, if they're completely true in all respects, indicate that China hasn't turned over a new leaf. So we've got to be tough-minded in response, and we've got to get a lot of countries with us. And I think we can do that.
Let's talk about that kind of unified response and consequences in the context of Ukraine, which you mentioned earlier, where, of course, Russia's effort has been bolstered directly by China, by North Korea, who also was in that sort of autocratic axis photograph. NATO was very clear that China was the prime enabler of Russia, that Russia probably couldn't continue the war without that degree of support. But it raises the question, what's the follow-through? What's the consequence that might get China to reconsider? What would you advise?
Again, you need a united voice. In the Biden administration, all the way up to January 20 of 2025, the day we left office, we made this a major issue with the Chinese. And we said publicly then that we felt that there were several hundred Chinese companies delivering dual-use technologies to the Russian defense industrial base, that in some cases, microelectronics, for instance, there was 80 to 90% of what the Russians were receiving from anybody around the world were from China. The Chinese did what the Chinese always do. They denied the truth. They said publicly, and they said it to me, no, we're not doing this. And we said, well, you are doing it. We sanctioned several hundred Chinese companies. So again, it's important that the United States acts in a time like this. But to get the EU behind us, to get Japan behind us, would be even more effective. And to make it clear, there's a price to be paid. I think the EU has had leverage here. The potential dismemberment of Ukraine by Russia is an existential issue for Europe. Europe doesn't want to see a new Berlin Wall, a new dividing line between an authoritarian East and a democratic West. And so the EU has stopped working with China on a lot of issues because they've said to the Chinese, if you're not going to agree with us on the most important issue to us, that Europe be united and peaceful and free, then there are going to be consequences. And I think the EU pressure has been effective. It hasn't been conclusive because the Chinese keep doing it. And I think, the Chinese are demonstrating by their actions that they're not going to be peeled away from Putin. Early in the Trump administration, there were a lot of reports that some people in the Trump team thought we can just peel Putin away from China. That spectacle in Beijing this week in the parade, where Putin was in the honored position to the right of Xi Jinping, tells you everything you need to know. I think it was the 53rd time that those two leaders have met since 2012 when President Xi came into power. And they are close. They're as thick as thieves. And then you had this extraordinary photo of a third person, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, whose troops are in Ukraine fighting for the Russians. So I thought that imagery, John, was really jarring. This is a real coalition, China, Russia, North Korea, and at times Iran. And their goal is not just to be troublemakers. Their goal is to overtake the United States and the democratic countries in total power and to subvert our power and our role in the world and to deny what we want, which is democracy around the world, human rights, and peace in Ukraine and justice in Ukraine. So this is a major threat. And I think in a way, I hope this is the Wall Street Journal had a very good editorial on this, saying this has to be a wake-up call for the Trump administration and for all Americans, not just for the administration. We have got to raise our defense budget. We have to be concerted, working with our allies. You and I have now said this 3 or 4 times in the last 20 minutes. We're stronger when we work with our allies than when we work alone. That's a message that clearly that President Trump doesn't agree with. And I hope members of his administration can convince him that Japan is really important here, that South Korea is important, but certainly the NATO countries in the context of Ukraine are pivotal for us. And therefore, give President Zelensky 100% American support. That's the only way to convince Putin to agree to a ceasefire.
Well, that takes us back a week or two to the Alaska summit. You are a storied diplomat, a student of diplomacy. We can go think back to summits at Reykjavik and others. They don't always have an immediately positive outcome, but never have I seen such a feting, a fawning lead to nothing. Obviously, Putin is just playing Donald Trump. There's no any evident interest in peace in Ukraine. They could have peace tomorrow. Instead, there's escalation. So what's your assessment of that summit right now?
It was a mistake to meet Putin, number one. Number two, it was a real mistake to invite him to the United States. He was in isolation. He had been shunned by the entire democratic world for the last 3.5 years since he invaded Ukraine. And to bring him onto our soil in Alaska, particularly Alaska, given the associations with, the sale of Alaska to the United States back in 1867, I thought it was really shameful. And then, of course, President Trump going into the meeting said publicly the day before the meeting, I want a ceasefire and there'll be sanctions and consequences if he doesn't agree to it. And then Putin didn't agree with it and there were no sanctions. And then the administration kind of raised its hands and said, well, we've tried diplomacy. Well, diplomacy sometimes takes weeks, months, years. You can't give up after one meeting. But they shouldn't have invited him. And he showed his true colors. He's not going to stop. He feels he has the advantage. He feels he can take more territory away from Ukraine before there is some kind of ceasefire. And so we've got to go back to where President Biden was. And that is 100% support for the Ukrainians. They're the victims in this war. For President Zelensky, I'm glad that the United States is allowing Europe to purchase American weapons for Ukraine. I think the United States should continue to give those weapons ourselves to Ukraine as well, to bolster the offensive capability and defensive capability of the Ukrainian forces. That's the only way to stop Putin and to send him the signal that if he doesn't stop, there'll be sanctions. So right now, it's almost like we have a toothless policy. There are no repercussions for Putin for defying the goals that President Trump said were central to that Alaska meeting. I don't get it. And I really hope, again, when you hit a brick wall, when your policy doesn't work, you've got to eat a little crow and say, okay, that didn't work. We're going to try something else. And getting tougher against Putin is the way to go.
Well, that would imply an ability to admit there's been a mistake. But instead, we've seen this sort of, obviously, Trump's instincts are more aligned with Putin, historically, intermittently, than they have been with Zelensky. But, that summit seems to have been a disaster. And we'll see if it's a turning point. It's notable, though, a lot of the neo-isolationist crowd, it's one way of saying it, inside the administration, used the idea that somehow we would focus our efforts at containing China, which they saw as a threat, and try to realign Putin on both fronts. That has utterly failed. Right. And you wonder when there's going to be a kind of bipartisan wake-up call and maybe some spine in the Senate. Because just yesterday, Mitch McConnell, of all people, saying it's the most dangerous time since the 1930s. Do you agree with that?
I think it's a dangerous time. I mean, we've lived through other dangerous times, certainly the Cold War, certainly the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's dangerous because you can see the balance of power shifting in the world. We now have that coalition of countries that you and I talked about, those people on parade, the axis of autocrats, so self-confident in Beijing just yesterday. They do not have good intentions toward the United States. They want to cut us down in power. And let me be specific. China wants to overtake us as the strongest military power in the Indo-Pacific, which is the most important arena in the world right now, economically, militarily, technologically. They want to use their power to denigrate what Truman and Eisenhower built and JFK and Reagan built, and that is NATO and our defense alliances in East Asia and our advancement of human rights and democracy as central pillars of what the international system should be. They want to remake the international system in their image for autocrats against human rights. So there's a lot at stake now. And the world needs an American leader, an American leadership that is certain, that is clear, that is strong and consistent. That's what they had in Harry Truman. And certainly
that's
in Ronald
not what
Reagan.
We have now, Ambassador.
It's not what we have now. And so I think that's what worries me, I think this is a very worrisome time. And so Americans need to be outward looking and understand that, what happens in these places like Ukraine really do have a major impact here at home. And there's that direct link. We learned this with bitter experience when we didn't. In the 1930s, we did not oppose the rise of Hitler, the rise of Mussolini, the strengthening of the Imperial Japanese staff in the 1930s. I actually thought that the lesson had been learned forever after the Second World War, that the United States has to be outward looking and lead. But we're now debating that again, and we're not seeing the consistent, decisive leadership from the Oval Office that we need.
We are not. Before we go, I wanted to ask you something about, it was a curio from that sinister photo op. That Prime Minister Xi and Putin and Kim Jong-un were walking, and they were caught in a hot mic talking about living forever, expanding human lifespan, using what presumably are harvested organ donors. It was really bizarre. And I mention it not because it's as significant as the geostrategic stakes, but it offered what, as a diplomat, might be interesting to hear your analysis of that kind of hot mic moment.
Well, I thought it was bizarre because I don't think there's anybody who believes that technology is available now, if it ever will be, number one. Number two, however, both of them are in their early 70s. Both of them are presidents for life. Both of them have huge territorial ambitions that run counter to us and other countries, which makes them dangerous. I mean, they've got to believe they're in their early 70s. They don't have all the time in the world. They can't guarantee that they're going to be in power 10 or 15, certainly not 20 years from now. And so the big question I think we've been debating in the U.S. and around the world over the last couple of years is, does that make them more dangerous? Will they believe that they've got to go for Taiwan or the end game on Ukraine sooner rather than later because they might not be around later? So I thought that was incongruous, that discussion, because there are no scientists believe that this is going to be immediately available for them or for you or for me. And so a little bit of otherworldly thinking. It was interesting. I'd never seen anything like that happen before. Usually the Chinese are quite rigorous in shielding themselves from the press, but have a hot mic, a conversation like that, I think there's a lot to think about. And I think their sense of mortality does have an impact on their timeline for some of these things that we worry about.
It was a strange 21st century moment. Reminded me of something that happened at the Potsdam conference where Harry Truman glanced over and Stalin was doodling, and it was always the heads of wolves. Ambassador Nicholas Burns, thank you very much for joining us on How to Fix It.